Good morning and welcome. My name is Lauren, and if we haven't had a chance to meet yet, I'm part of the speaking team here. It is so good to be with you on this gorgeous sunny morning. It was interesting at the beginning, before the service started, maybe you caught some of the pictures of one of our TMP hangouts. There's going to be another one in 2 weeks, August the 30th. It was really fun this last Sunday to see a few of you there. The locations are going to be the same: Neck Point Park, Westwood Lake Park, and Parksville Community Beach. So you might want to mark your calendar now, but there will be some reminders coming out as well. But you can show up at any one that you choose, 1 p.m., and maybe we'll see you there in a couple of weeks. We're in the middle of a series called Not a Nice Guy, and we have been taking a look at some of the rather shocking and, kind of distressing, potentially, things that Jesus said and that he did that can leave us to wonder, was he maybe not a nice guy? And like we like to do around here, we've kind of been digging in a little bit and taking a look at what was the backstory, what was really going on, and see maybe how it might apply to our lives today. And, potentially also look at some of the preconceptions that we hold without even realizing it. The last 2 Sundays, Gary's walked us through 2 stories that unintentionally actually had a lot in common. They were both on a lake, they were at night, and they were both in a storm. And both of them have really powerful implications for our lives today. If you missed either one of those, you can catch up anytime using our TMP app, or you can go to the website, themeetingplace.org, and check them out there. So today, I am going to just dive right in because I am really excited to go through this particular story with you this morning, as well as kind of unpack a little bit of first century Jewish history to help us kind of take a look at what was really going on and what we're talking about today. So listen to this. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. So Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then, going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." There aren't too many places in the Bible where we see Jesus angry. And it potentially can be a little uncomfortable, right? I certainly grew up where angry equaled bad, and there was absolutely no space to be angry. And the examples that I saw were people who, if they were starting to get a little bit angry, they would, eliminate that word completely. They might admit to being a little frosty, perhaps, or like irritated, maybe. Maybe frustrated would be an okay word, but admitting anger would just never be a thing. And it's kind of funny. After, some years of living myself, I have to admit that I kind of like angry Jesus. He's real. He's relatable. And let's just see maybe what you think as we explore this together today. There's a lot of times that it's just super easy to be angry, right? There's someone I know who says this a lot, and I kind of agree. It's easy. Angry is easy. It's kind of the easy way out often. And of course, we associate angry with out of control, which isn't always the case. But there's those times when, you're driving in traffic and, some aggressive person comes and cuts you off dangerously. I mean, it's easy to be angry. Or when your kids, they don't listen again and again. Or maybe someone at work takes your idea and claims it as their own. There's a lot of times like that. And we want to take a moment here and question, what was it really that brought Jesus to anger? What made him angry? And that day in the temple did not reveal a passive, uninvolved, hands-off kind of Jesus, which can be kind of uncomfortable because most of us seem to have a stereotypical idea of Jesus that he was passive. But I'll just throw this out for you to consider. Jesus being angry was good, and maybe even really kind of cool. Let's take a deeper look at this about what fueled Jesus' anger and why the people that got so upset about this when you look at all 4 of the accounts of this story in the biographies of Jesus, the only people that got upset were the religious leaders. We're going to take a look at that. So this event took place in a real place, in a culture that is not like our own, in an ancient time that's really easy to misunderstand. And so I invite you to put yourself in the story, and I'm kind of going to do my best to help you be able to transport you into the place where this took place. At the time of Jesus, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem had recently been renovated by the Roman-appointed king. His name was Herod. He had spent huge sums of money to expand and rebuild the temple on Mount Moriah, called the Temple Mount. And as you can see in this drawing that he built, a platform around the outside of the structure, and it was held up by a series of retaining walls. The entire platform was organized into concentric areas, with the inner circle, which was the temple itself, was reserved for the priests, who were men. The middle circle in blue was for the Jews, but if you were a woman and a Jew, you were confined to a smaller area on the edge. The whole outer part of the circle, which you can see in purple, was a courtyard for the Gentiles, for anyone who was not a Jew. This area was a popular place for public gatherings because it was the only area that non-Jews were permitted in the whole Temple Mount. And it's debated by scholars, but it's likely that when Jesus taught at the temple throughout his years of ministry, he taught on the far left there, under the shade of what is known as the royal stoa. This also means that when Jesus spoke, he did not just speak to in secret to the elite, but instead he spoke where everyone had access, in the location where everyone could hear his words. I think it's helpful to note that Jesus' entry into humanity was around 0 AD, we now call that current era, where the most common religious system at that time was characterized by what we call the temple model. The temple model wasn't just related to this Jewish sacred place, the temple that we just looked at. It's actually a whole approach to religion that was common amongst the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, even, ancient Judaism. And you can still see this structure in some religious models today. There's some important markers about the temple model that are really interesting to look at. The first one is that there's always a sacred place. It's that place where you have to be really quiet, and that there's a lot of reverence. There's almost always some big event that happened at this sacred place. There's always sacred texts, usually written down. Sometimes they were spoken by a sacred person, but they're always in the sacred place. There's always sacred men. It's really important to note there were never sacred women in the temple model. It was only men. And they had possession of the texts. And it was their job to tell the regular people like you and me what those texts said. And they would say things like, if you don't do this, this, and this according to the sacred text, God's going to get you. And I know this because I'm the sacred man and I look after the sacred text and the sacred place. So there was a natural elitism that came about in this system. So regular people would live in fear and often superstition, and this kind of characterized religious life at the time when Jesus was walking, the dusty streets of Palestine at that time. So in order for people to be in compliance with the Jewish temple model during Passover, which is when this story took place, thousands of pilgrims would be traveling from all over the known world, sometimes thousands of miles, to get to Jerusalem so that they could go to that sacred place and bring an unblemished animal for their sacrifice, so that they could be right with God. So upon arrival in Jerusalem, they would usually need to purchase, this appropriate animal for their family sacrifice, because it simply just wasn't practical to be traveling hundreds or, even further with your animal. And it's interesting to note that according to scholars, you didn't always buy your animals in the temple. Actually, for most of history, you actually purchased your animals outside of the temple area. But at this point in history, the only place to buy the animal that you needed was in that court of the Gentiles that we just saw, inside the temple. So anyone who came to the temple, they also needed to pay a small temple tax. It was part of, the upkeep of the temple. But it was required that they needed to exchange the money that they brought into the temple currency. See, because the Roman denarii and the drachma that were used along with other currencies were not permitted in the temple. And you may ask why. It's because there was always a person's face on the coin. This example is of Marcus Aurelius. And you can see that, even today, we have the queen or presidents on our coins. It was considered blasphemy. So they needed to have the coins that were okay to use in the temple. So these pilgrims needing to exchange their money, they were actually they needed money for the tax, for their animals, and they were actually taken advantage of financially in two specific ways. First of all, the money changers would charge them a far greater exchange rate than was necessary. And, maybe you've experienced a little bit of this when you're maybe at the airport exchanging your money or, maybe at your hotel. But the thing is, there was more to it than that. They actually did not have any other place they could exchange their money than this place that charged them too much. There was also a monopoly on the animals that qualified for temple sacrifice. As I mentioned a moment ago, there was no other place for them to purchase these animals. And they were charged an exorbitant fee for these animals. And all of that extra money was actually going to line the pockets of the high priest's family. The elite of the religious leaders who benefited from this whole tidy scheme also were in charge of the money changers, and they were also in charge of the animal sellers. Pretty, wrapped up kind of thing going on there. Well, on top of this financial exploitation, it was actually even worse. There was no other option for people who wanted to worship God. If you were a non-Jew like you and I, the only place for us would have been that noisy place of commerce. There was no quiet place that you could go. And so as far as, real life goes, their access to God was essentially just cut off. The original temple system, that God actually spoke to Moses about thousands of years ago, was actually originally designed to help relieve people of the tyranny, of the guilt that they carried, and give them an opportunity and a way to reconcile the communion with God. And now it had become completely twisted. There was no way for God to be accessible except for the elite. So isn't it no wonder, that Jesus' natural emotion of anger was directed at removing this problem, driving out the animals and flipping the tables. His words of passion are really important to note. He said to them, "The scriptures declare, my temple will be called a house of prayer," get this, "for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." And I can just picture Jesus saying that you've systemized this den of thieves. You see, Jesus didn't just flip over some tables. He actually flipped over a whole system of injustice. The temple model was built around a standard that only the elite could possibly, maybe even meet. The temple model required that people come to the temple, the sacred place, to meet God, to make peace with God with that sacrifice. And they needed to do this regularly. There was no other option. But then Jesus came along and he simplified the standard. And instead of people having all of this external striving, that they had to do everything just right, including their sacrifice, Jesus flipped the script and he offered himself as the sacrifice in the place of the animals that were needing to be sacrificed again and again. And he did this for the entire world, once and for all. Which is why today, and actually since that time, we don't have to go to a sacred place for an annual sacrifice. Or we really don't have to go to the sacred place for anything specifically. The temple model required all reconciliation needed to be done through the sacred place and through the sacred men. And Jesus came along and he's like, forget that. Now I want you to reconcile with your neighbor directly. I want you to reconcile with me directly. So with God, we can talk to him anywhere, anytime, nothing in between. Jesus came so that everyone would have the opportunity to have access to God, and that no longer was it just the elite men who could talk to God directly. Now, women and children and non-Jews, everyone is welcome. Jesus completely leveled the playing field. So now, when you read that account of Jesus entering the temple that day, imagine with me the racket going on. Can you picture it? You know, you're in that court of the Gentiles, and there are, who knows, hundreds, maybe even 1,000 more people, pushing together. Smells of the animals, the noises of the animals, the smells of the people, I'm quite sure, having traveled a long time. You know, the impatience, the chaos, the bartering, the lineups. There was no possibility in that place for there to be a quiet place to talk to God, to pray for a non-Jew. The only place that was like far enough away from that commotion was only for the Jews. There was no access for non-Jews. So Jesus stepped into that scene. He creates a whip. He builds it right there. That took a few minutes. A whip that was used to herd animals. And with righteous indignation, he took radical action, turfing the tables, driving the animals out, and scattering money on the floor, and declaring that this was not okay. And all of this was to stop the exploitation of the outsider, to diminish the control of the religious elite over the people, and to restore the opportunity for all to worship God. Dang, I kind of love him for that. So when we read that story I'm going to read it for you from another one of the biographies, so a little bit of a different angle. Listen again. When they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. He said to them, "The scriptures declare, my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." Are these words of an angry, out of control God? Or are these words of a God who is affronted by the people who are desperate to connect with him and he with them, and they are being taken advantage of? There's a quote from Abraham Lincoln that caught my attention this week. "You can tell the greatness of a man by what makes him angry." Interesting. The story goes on to reveal that the only ones violently upset by Jesus' actions that day were not the people, but instead, when the leading priests and teachers of religious law heard what Jesus had done, they began planning how to kill him. But they were afraid of him because the people were so amazed by his teaching. Jesus spoke against the systemized tyranny from the elite who were actually benefiting from people's genuine desire to connect with God. And here's a question for you to consider. How might you be part of bringing relief from injustice in your area of influence? If you've decided already at some point, or maybe you will at some point, or you're maybe continuing to surrender to God's love for you, we have work to do to metaphorically flip tables, to be part of changing systems of injustice that are in the areas that we live, our community, our work. And maybe you're being nudged that you're actually maybe sitting at a table that there's someone missing from that table, someone who should be there, and you need to speak up about that. Here's the thing, though. It's difficult to flip tables when we are comfortably seated around those tables, right? And sometimes it's also not easy to even recognize that someone is missing when it's kind of been this way, kind of as far back as we can remember. Where are those that are missing? And why are they not here? Are there systems that make it difficult for them to be at the table with us? Well, to be honest, there are times when I really want to flip some tables, and maybe some people too. And it's also true that as much as I would like to flip some people over, Jesus did not do that. He drove out the animals. He flipped over the tables. He made a very clear statement. But he also used his voice to speak change. He was not out of control. He was strategic. It's also really refreshing and, to kind of think about really that God's response, Jesus' response to me has never been to flip me over, even though I may have needed it at times. This story reveals a powerful example of Jesus dealing with injustice and actually systems of injustice. But if you want to also see how Jesus dealt with people, stay tuned around here. Continue coming and listening on the live stream on Sunday mornings. But I also encourage you to kind of investigate yourself. Take a look at the first 4 books of the New Testament, the 4 biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and specifically dial in and notice, how did Jesus treat the people who were marginalized in his day? The children, the women, the foreigners, people who were poor, sick. I'm going to pray together. I'm going to pray myself, actually, but I invite you, where you're at right now, to maybe pray with me that you and I would come to know this Jesus even more. And that as you receive more and more of his love, that you will sense where he is asking you and I to take action in the specific places in our areas, not outside of our areas, but where we have influence and where he's asking you to take action. Would you pray with me? God, thank you so much that we have an opportunity to see you in action and with emotions that we can relate to, and that you cared enough about the things that really make us upset as well. When we're not treated right, when people we love aren't treated right, thank you that you care about these things. And thank you that we've had an opportunity here to kind of dive into this a little bit and shed some light on this glorious emotion that you had that changed things, and that you became part of the solution by offering yourself. Thank you that so much that we don't live today by the temple system, that we can talk to you anywhere, anytime, and that we can on our own read these sacred texts. We can read the biographies of Jesus ourselves, and we can talk to you anywhere. And we just pray for each one of us that we would clearly know when you're asking us to take action, and that you would help us to get to know you better, even these parts of you that can feel a little uncomfortable. Thank you that you love us, and thank you that all of what you did was to show us how much you care. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.